Welcome to part 87. My video season is Blender 2.7. In this video, we'll be talking about volumetric lighting. In other words, atmospheric lighting that sort of looks like fog or dust in a room when a light shines through it. This can really add a sense of realism to your scene, and it's very easy to do. But in this video, I'm going to be showing you two examples and going through exactly how you can customize your scene, and there's actually a few different ways that you can add volumetric lighting to a scene. In our two examples, we're going to make a spotlight on a monkey head that's in the middle of a floor, and we're also going to make a room with light shining through a window on the other side of the room, and you'll see how both of those scenes are made, again, two different ways. Of course, if you like this video or if you learned something, go ahead and click on that like button below this video on YouTube. It really helps me out, and if you want to see more videos like this one in Blender and in Tech, click on that subscribe button as well, and click on that little bell icon to get notified whenever I upload a new tutorial. Let's go ahead and jump in. I'll click on my splash screen to get rid of it. The first scene we're going to make is a spotlight on a monkey head. I'm going to go ahead and with the default cube selected, I'm going to press X on my keyboard and then click on delete to get rid of it. I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard. Shift A brings up the add menu. I'm going to go to the mesh category and add a mesh plane. That's going to be my ground. I'm going to tap S on my keyboard to scale up, and I'll move my mouse out and click. I'm going to press Shift A again on my keyboard to bring up the add menu. I'm going to add a mesh monkey head. That's going to be our subject. This is Suzanne the monkey head, but Suzanne has very large faces or polygons, so it looks very blocky. So on the tool shelf, and if you don't have that up, you can press this little plus or the T key on your keyboard. I'm going to set its shading with it selected to smooth. I'm also going to go over to the side properties window over here and go to my wrench tab, which is where you add modifiers, and I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier that will make it look very nice and smooth. And in the subsurf modifier settings, I can turn the view subdivisions up to 1. There we go. Let's go ahead and add a material just so we can kind of get a nice look here. In order to add a material though, I'm going to switch over to the cycles render engine, and that is not the engine that you use by default, so you have to change that up here. The default is the Blender render engine in this version of Blender, so I'll select cycles, and then everything, the way we add lights and nodes and materials, all changes. So if you get that step, do not forget that step, because if you do, everything will look different from this point on. It's easy to miss that if you're new to Blender. With the monkey head selected, I'm going to go to the materials tab, and because we're using cycles, nothing is here until I click on new. This adds a new material to the object, and by default it uses what's called a diffuse shader. I'm not going to use that though. I'm going to switch that to a principled BSDF shader, and this is a new shader in Blender, at least this version or last version. I'm not sure exactly when it came out, but this is basically a material shader that can do pretty much anything, all in the same shader type. So you can do really anything here. You can make it shiny or mirrored or dull, and it'll be very realistic, but I'm just going to go ahead and change my base color. So I'll click in that white area and I'll change it to green. I don't see that in my window though, because my viewport shading is set to solid, so I'm going to change it to material, and now I'll see the actual colors in my scene. But let's go ahead and get on to lighting. I'm going to select the lamp in my scene, which is just a point lamp, which is just one little speck that shines light. I'm going to change that to a spotlight, and to do that I'm going to select it, and then in the properties window I'm going to go to the lamp tab, and then I'm going to change it from a point lamp to a spotlight. This spotlight has way too wide of an angle though, so I'm going to change the size under the spot shape section down just by clicking and dragging in that section to make it, more of a spotlight shape. And I'm going to tap G on my keyboard to grab it, and I'll just move it up. Maybe I'll make it a little bit more narrow. Now you can't really easily see where the spotlight is going to exactly shine, and the way you can fix that is you can check this little checkbox that says show cone, and when you do that you can really see where it is. In order to rotate it though, I'm going to double tap R on my keyboard, RR, really quick, and then I can just move my mouse in a circle, and if you can control it, it's a little bit tricky, then you can rotate it however you want. So that's the R key twice quick on your keyboard, then it'll let you spin it kind of organically. If I just were to render this scene right now, I'm going to go to my camera tab, I'm going to click on render, but before I do that, I'm going to press 0 on my number pad. That'll go through my camera. If you don't have a number pad on your keyboard, you can go down to View and Camera right there. That'll break you out of the camera or get you into the camera. That's how the scene will look, but I want to zoom out a little bit. So I'm actually going to go to the Side N Properties panel. So I can tap N on my keyboard or just press that little plus. And if I want to control the camera through the camera, I can check this little checkbox under View. It's called Lock Camera to View. Once you have that checkbox selected, you can then just orbit your camera. You can select an object and it might rotate around it, and then you can just easily position the camera. If you don't have that checked, when you try to orbit through the camera, it'll just break out of the camera. It won't let you move the camera when you're looking through it, unfortunately. So that's that solved there. I'm going to zoom out and then kind of pan around, and so I have a good angle now. And let's go ahead and see what that looks like. I'm going to do a quick render. And as you can see, it does not look that great, and we don't have that atmosphere. What I'll do is I'm going to change my background to black. That's the world color. And in order to do that, I'm going to go to my world tab. I can click right under surface. I can click in this little box and choose just black with the color picker. But in order to add volumetrics, there are two ways of doing it really. You can make volumetrics in your entire world in your scene, or you can specify one zone. In other words, an object like a big box that's going to contain volumetric or a volumetric material. And so if you do it that way, you can limit where the dust or fog is in your scene. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on Use Nodes, because that lets me add volume. This section is now here because I clicked on Use Nodes to my entire world. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select volume, and right now it has no volume. I'm going to select volume scatter, and when I do that, I get some options. What I want to do here first is change the color to totally white. Right now it's a little bit darker than white, so I'm going to slide that up, and I'm going to change my density. If I were to render this right now, I think I would probably see black. I'm actually going to try that. I'll render that out. Yeah, I see entirely black, and that's because my world is basically now totally solid. There's no light going through it because it's a solid volume, my entire world. So I'm going to press Escape on my keyboard. In order to change that, again, under the World tab, I'm going to change the density of my world to 0.1 instead of just 1, and I'll press Enter. And now, if I go back and render my scene, I see nothing because my light is way too low. It's not bright enough. So I'm going to go ahead and press Escape. Let's go ahead and select the lamp. If I go under the lamp tab now with the lamp selected, I'm going to click on Use Nodes, and that way I can change the strength. I'm going to change the strength all the way up to, let's say, about 5,000. Because we now have a volume, we have fog that actually absorbs some light in our scene, you need to have a brighter lamp than you normally would. I would probably have this down at about 1,000 if I didn't have volumetrics in my scene. So I'm going to use 5,000. Let's go ahead and go back to the camera tab and render this out. And as you can see, we have a little bit of fog, but again, the light is still way too dark. So I'm going to press Escape on my keyboard. Really quickly, I'll change the strength of this lamp up to, let's say, 15,000. That's one too many zeros, I think, and I'll press Enter, and I'll render one more time. Okay, so we have our effect. I'm actually going to fix a few issues here. My lamp is still too dark, but also I'm getting these white and colored specks in my scene. These are called fireflies, and they're remnants of an error or bug with the Cycles render engine. So this is actually a very simple fix. If you have too many white speckles in your scene, that's an easy fix. If I press Escape, what I'm going to do is change my lamp brightness up to, let's say, 25,000. And I think that's one too many zeros. There we go. And I'm going to go under the Render tab, and under Sampling, what I can do is I can clamp the indirect light bounces in my scene. You have Clamp Direct and Clamp Indirect. Again, this is under Sampling, under the Camera tab. I'm going to clamp Direct. I'll just change that to 1 and press Enter. Let's go ahead and see what this looks like after we render out again. Alright, so there's our rendered scene. It looks pretty good. I would probably adjust the light to be on the other side of the character so it was shining on the monkey head's face. But there you go. Let's go ahead and make the next example, because I want to show you how to make your atmosphere limited to one area in your world. So I'm going to go to File and New, and then click on Reload Startup File, and I'm going to take the default cube and I'm going to change this into a room with a window. So I'm going to tap S on my keyboard to scale it up by about 3 or 4 times, just like that. I want to make the room a little bit longer, so I'll tap S on my keyboard to scale it, but then I'll tap Y on my keyboard. So S and then Y, and then I can move my mouse and it'll scale it only in that direction. I'm going to make a window in this room, but I'm going to cut away one of the ends first. Before I do that though, because I'm going to use the bevel tool to make the window, or at least the bars in the window, I'm going to go down to Object and Apply and Rotation and Scale. Whenever you do modeling and scaling and beveling, it's a good idea to use this or apply the rotation and scale of your object so things don't end up stretching as you're modeling them. That's just a good practice to do. So apply rotation and scale like that. Let's go ahead and press Tab to go into edit mode. I'll select the end face right there. I'll press X and then faces to delete that face. This is where things would be a little bit harder if I hadn't applied the rotation and scale, or at least the scale. I'm going to go ahead and make a few loop cuts, so I'll tap Control R on my keyboard. I'm going to go around the side of the room, and so I'll click and move it up just like that. If you're not familiar with how to do loop cuts in edit mode in Blender, I'll put a link to my video on the basics of edit mode on the screen right now. I'm also now, because this is just one edge and I want the top of the window and the bottom of the window, I'm going to bevel this into 2. So I'll press Control B on my keyboard and then move my mouse out, and then I will click. And if you're not familiar with how to use the bevel tool in Blender, I'll put a link to that video on the screen right now as well, so you can go ahead and check that out. Let's go ahead and press Control R again to make another loop cut. I'll click, and then Control B to bevel it out. So now I have the area of my window, but I want to put some bars through it, so I'll tap Control R. In fact, after I type Control R, I'm going to scroll up once to make 2 bars in that direction. You can go crazy if you scroll, but I'm just going to make 2. I'm going to click and then right click. I'll do the same over here. Control R, click, and right click. Now I want to make these bars, this edge loop and this one, thicker. So I'm going to bevel them all together. So in order to select a whole edge loop like I do right now, I'm going to hold Alt. I'm going to press A actually to deselect. I'm going to hold Alt, and I'm going to right click on that edge. And when you hold Alt and right click on an edge, when you're in edge select mode, it will select that whole connected edge end to end, okay? If I do that again, but I hold Shift, so I'm holding Shift and Alt, I can select that edge loop and maintain or add to my original selection, and I'll hold Shift and Alt still, and I'll right click on that one. And now I'm going to bevel all of these just a little tiny bit. So Control B, and I'll pull my mouse out, and now I have some bars. So I'm going to go ahead into face select mode, select all these window faces, and press X and delete those faces. So now I have a window. Let's go ahead and press Tab, back into object mode. I want to give my wall some thickness, so I'm going to go again to the wrench tab, and under modifiers, I'm going to add the solidify modifier, and that will give this some thickness. Once you add the solidify modifier, you can adjust the thickness. I'm going to turn it up a little bit, and as you can see, the inside of my room gets it gets a bit smaller because the walls are getting thicker. You'll notice that your walls won't be even, most likely. They'll try to kind of taper a little bit, and that's because you have to check even thickness, and that will be fixed. So I'm going to make a little bit thinner, and I'll press Apply. I'm going to make a light shining through that window, and there's going to be a fog stream in the shape of the windows going through to the other side of the room where the light is being cast. So I'm going to take my point light, and I'm just going to put it sort of right. I'm going to press actually 1 on my viewport on my keyboard, and then 5 to go into front orthographic, and that way I can move my lamp with the G key up here, and then I'll go to my top view with the 7 key and put it right there. So I think that's lined up Okay, I'm going to put my camera at the end of the room, so I'll tap 0 to go through my camera view. I'm going to press N and then check that lock camera to view, and now I can orbit to put the camera right about there. Let's go ahead and do a quick render, or at least go into viewport shading, render to see what that looks like. You can see now that we're in the inside of the room, but the light is not really bouncing around, and that's because we have not selected or switched to the cycles render engine yet. So I'm going to do that right now. I'll switch to the cycles render engine, and it looks a lot maybe more realistic because it's not totally black, but that lamp needs to be brighter. So I'm going to select the lamp over here in the outliner window, and then go to the lamp tab, and then I'll click on use nodes and change the strength of my lamp. It's just one little point, remember. I'm going to change it up to let's say 1,000. So now we have that effect. In fact, I'm going to go up to 5,000 so it's nice and bright. And if I split this window into two, I can just grab this little triangular cross-hatched area and drag it straight down. That's how I can divide my window into two. And I'm going to press 0 to break out of my camera up here. If I move the lamp, you'll see that I can move where the light is shining on the wall, so I can specify that. If I move it farther away, I can make the glow or the light on the other side of the wall smaller. If I move it closer, I can make it quite a bit bigger. So that's up to you. I'm going to move it to right about, let's say right there, sure, on the floor. That's not quite bright enough, so I'll make that a bit brighter, let's say 8,000. And press enter. Now what I don't want to do this time is I do not want to enable volumetrics in my whole world. I will though select the color of the surface of my world and make it black, just so we're not getting any light seeping in through the other end. And what I'm going to do in this case though is I'm going to add a box to my room that's going to encompass the whole inside of the room pretty much, and that box is going to have a volumetric material on it. So I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard to bring up the add menu. I'm going to add a cube. It's right there. It's way too small though, so I'll tap S to scale it up like that, and then S and then Y on my keyboard to scale it a bit that way. I don't need the volumetrics to go all the way out to this side of the room, but I am going to have them go all the way to the other end of the room, so that looks about good to me. Now I don't want to have to look at this cube the entire time, so I'm going to go over to the I believe it's the object tab, and I'm going to change the display type to not that one, not wire, but I'm going to change the maximum draw type to wire. So now in my viewport that cube only looks like a wire outline, so I can still see into the room. Now it's not going to render like that because I need to give it a material, so I'm going to go to the materials tab, click new. I actually do not want this cube to have any surface material at all, so I'm going to click on diffuse and say remove. So now it doesn't have material, but I want to have a volume material, so I'm going to select volume none. I'm going to select again that same volume scatter. And when I do that, maybe down here in the scene, you can see I'm getting a little bit of light coming through and you can see it, but again, the density is way too high. So I'll tap 0.1 and press enter, and now we have that scene. This might be a better option for you to use a cube that has a volume scatter, volume material on it, instead of having your whole world have that volume scatter world volume material. You might find that on slower computers it works a little bit better for you. But let's go ahead and customize the look of this dust or fog in the room. In order to do that, I'm not going to use just these material settings. I'm going to split this window up here into two, and I'm going to change this window over here into a node editor window. And with that cube, that fog cube or dust cube selected, I'm going to go to my material right there, nodes, and as you can see, I've got a volume scatter. I'm going to press T and N to hide the side panels, and I'll zoom in so you can see this a little bit better. I've got a volume scatter node plugged into my material output. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to press Shift A. I'm going to add a let's say a shader. I'm going to add an add shader. So shader, add shader, after I press Shift A on my keyboard. And that add shader is going to add together not only a volume scatter material. I'm going to add in to that I'll press Shift A, shader. We're going to add a volume absorption, and I'll talk about what the difference is and why you would want to use that, but I'll go ahead and connect that up just by clicking and dragging, of course. These two nodes can work together to get any kind of a fog light that you want in terms of how long the fog goes on and how thick the fog is and how dark your room is, in terms of how much light bounces around. This volume absorption, I'm just going to select it and press M on my keyboard to mute it. Makes it so that your space, your volume, will not allow light to pass through as easily. It will make it so that the actual atmosphere absorbs light, and therefore you won't get light reaching to the far corners of your room. So as you can see right now, I can see faintly the corners and edges of my walls, but if I re-enable this node by pressing M to unmute it, you can see that the room gets a whole lot darker. Of course, if you have this enabled, you can change it to any value you like. If I change it to 0.1, the effect is much more minimized, but it still is a little bit darker in the corners of my room than it otherwise would be. This setting, we've already looked at density. We know what that is. That means the density of the volume material in your room. This anisotropy, I'm not sure how to say that, anisotropy, has to do with light being scattered as it passes through the actual atmosphere. And what that will mean to you is if light is traveling through the room and as it's going through the volume, the light is becoming scattered and less focused, what that will do is it'll make the fog appear to fade out more over time. So if I change this anisotropy, I'm not sure how to say that again, to 0.5 and I press enter, you'll notice that the fog doesn't go quite to the highlight on the wall. If I turn this up to, let's say, 1.5, you'll see that we get barely any fog, and down to about 0.8, you'll see that the fog only really goes to about there. Of course, when you're using this method of adding volumetrics to your scene, you still might need to go to the camera tab and to sampling and to clamp your direct light bounces, or indirect light bounces, pardon me, to 1 so you don't get those fireflies. Let's go ahead and I'm going to set up my GPU for GPU rendering, because in this version of Blender, Blender 2.79, Volumetrics does now work with GPU rendering, at least with NVIDIA based graphics cards. So I'm going to change my device to GPU compute. I'm going to change my performance at the bottom of the camera tab, so I'm using larger render tiles. By the way, if you've not seen my video on rendering and increasing rendering speeds, including how to use NVIDIA based CUDA rendering in Blender, I'll put a link to that video on the screen right now. But basically I have to have bigger tiles when I render out, so I'm going to use tiles that are 256 by 256 pixels. That should be pretty good. The last thing I want to do to speed up my renders, and this is very important whether or not you're using GPU rendering or not, is to enable homogeneous rendering, and that is done under the World tab under Settings. This homogeneous setting, or homogeneous setting, was located somewhere else in previous versions of Blender, but it's here now, and when you check that, it'll speed up render times by assuming that the fog in your scene is even, it's not textured, or you don't have any smoke-like haze waves going in your scene, if you will. Let's go ahead and try rendering it out, but before I do, I'm going to select my lamp and make it brighter. Let's go to 15,000 and press enter, and I'll go and render my scene. Alright, so that's how it looks. Let's go ahead and zoom in on that. Looks not too bad. Of course, I could change and turn up my render samples and even turn on denoising in this new version of Blender 2.79 to make the scene look less speckly. And the way you do that is it is under the Render Layers tab. There's a new section in Blender 2.79 called denoising, and if you check that and render your scene out with lower samples like I have, it'll make the scene a whole lot less speckly. But that will be it for this video. Again, if you like this video or if you learned something, go ahead and click on that like button below. It really helps me out. And if you want to see more videos like this one in Blender and in Tech, click on that subscribe button as well, and check that little bell icon to get notified whenever I upload a new tutorial. Check out my Facebook page at facebook.com/borncg. On that page, I post updates and news about what I'm working on next, and often sneak peeks. Check me out there. Thanks a lot for watching. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.